Harris, Hegel, and the Psychologic System. This is part one of a three-part series. A young man from Webster Groves, a soldier in the army but interested in philosophy, met Henri Bergson in Paris. In the course of the conversation, the soldier mentioned that he came from St. Louis. "Oh," said Bergson, "that city that Dr. Harris made famous with his great insight into philosophy." Now, William Torrey Harris was a Yale dropout and a public school teacher, so why did Bergson view him so highly? Well, during his time, Harris was a very well-known philosopher. Harris was one of the pioneers of the St. Louis movement. Harris also offered insight into one of Hegel's most difficult texts, The Larger Logic. Harris was the secretary of the St. Louis Hegelians, and he, along with his group, started the first philosophical journal west of the Mississippi, the Speculative Journal of Philosophy. Harris and other members of the St. Louis Hegelians tasked themselves with translating Hegel's works. They read these works fluently in German and translated them into English as a hobby. Now, that should give you a fair bit of amount of insight into the man and his associates. They translated Hegel's Larger Logic as something to do after a 19th century workday. The Larger Logic was probably one of Hegel's most difficult books to read. Well, it is probably one of Hegel's most difficult books to read. And Hegel loved writing in his cryptic Hegelese, if you ever tried to read Hegel. Harris believed that the science of logic was the study of thought, or the thinking activity, as he termed it. Now, being, with a capital B for Harris, is when the will, unified with the intellect, comes to consciousness. Being, again with a capital B, is self-activity for Harris. William Torrey Harris was born in Killingly, Connecticut. There's a town called Killingly. Well, I don't know if it still exists, but that's the name. In 1835, he attended Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. He attended Yale for 2 years, and while at Yale, he excelled in all of his classes. He even developed occult interests. He studied Swedenborg, mesmerism, the transcendentalists, and even the early psychic phantasm movement. At some point, school was no longer a challenge for him. He left Yale during his junior year because he was fed up with the Scottish realism of Yale. Harris went to St. Louis in the summer of 1857. In St. Louis, Harris became a public school teacher. After a very short time in St. Louis, Harris met Henry Brookmeyer, a former owner of a shoemaking business, lawyer, and an avid Hegelian philosopher. When they discussed Hegel's untranslated works, Harris could certainly hold his own because he taught himself German at Yale when he grew tired of the Greek and Latin. Harris and Brookmeyer would meet at the Mercantile with other like-minded individuals and discuss Hegel's philosophy, as well as make translations. Next, the Society. The Philosophical Society came into the world and was proceeded into its work under the two leaders, Brookmeyer and Harris. According to Denton Snyder, the St. Louis movement was not a doctrine for a few, but a pervasive influence in the community. Denton Snyder was one of the younger members, and he knew well that philosophy brought not revenue, but rather expense. Each member had a day job, which brought them bread, but not the bread of life. Only philosophy could do that. And that's a direct quote, buddies. The president of the group was Brookmeyer, while the secretary was Harris. They were the officers because of their experience reading and writing Hegel. Reading and writing Hegel and other philosophers. The group first met in 1858. Snyder met them informally at a small gathering in North St. Louis in the autumn of 1865. Now, Harris was a zealous missionary by nature, and a great teacher, according to Snyder. He was deemed the philosophic master. Harris had all the works of Hegel in the original German. The primary task of the group was to translate and discuss Hegel's works. The Book of Fate, or the Bible of the group, was Hegel's Larger Logic. The logic was declared to be the movement of pure essences of the world, stripped from their outer illusory vestiture. The Larger Logic was known as the most difficult book in the world, and Snyder even said, "My wrestle with it was long and intense, and not wholly victorious at the close." But Snyder pulled through after years of entanglement. He pulled through his magic web of abstractions and obstructions and left them behind. He was not lost, but transcended. The first English translation of the logic existed only in writing, and it was made before the Civil War. After the Civil War, the logic became, for Harris, according to Snyder, his one supreme Bible, and it meant more to him than any other human production. And it was probably the source of his great spiritual transformation from social hostility and inner discord to reconciliation with his government and indeed the world order. Now, St. Louis was at the epicenter of German culture. Well, St. Louis was it was an epicenter of German culture. Although if you were there, you probably would have thought it was the epicenter of German culture. The revolution that occurred in Germany in 1848 pushed many German immigrants into St. Louis. These Germans were politically liberal-minded as opposed to St. Louis's original conservative population. Due to the large influx of German immigrants, St. Louis took many characteristics of a German city. Indeed, Snyder was an early organizer and an exponent of the St. Louis movement. This was a period of the influence of German philosophical thought. The period between 1861 and 1875 was known as the German era of St. Louis. St. Louis effectively became a German during the late 1840s. German language instruction was introduced in the public schools, and according to Snyder, bilingual citizenship was stoutly advocated. A substantial number of German language bookstores existed at this time. And in order to supply their patrons the journals and books, many had to be ordered from Berlin and Leipzig. Even the Mercantile still has various works by Nietzsche in German and English. It is no surprise that many Germans fought during the Civil War. After all, many of them came over as refugees in 1848. To think of, there was a time in American history where we were okay with refugees, but then again, they were white refugees, so okay. When Snyder reached St. Louis in 1864, the Great War was drawing to a close, and therewith, in proportion, the Germans of St. Louis were rising in authority and also in self-assertion. German regiments from St. Louis and from Missouri had been in the thick of the fight all the way, and soon they were returning home with a justifiable good opinion of themselves and their services. Here, accordingly, the Teutonic spirit was mounting upward in lofty self-confidence as compared with that of other elements. That is also a quote. That's not something I would write myself. It's a quote from Snyder. Anyway, after the Civil War, in which all had in some way participated, with Bruckmeyer fighting on the Union side, the group was understandably overwhelmed by the great historic appearance, as they termed it. They asked, what does it all mean? This was a universal question. After great philosophical thought, the group decided that a great world historic deed had been done with enormous labor and outer panoramic pageantry. But what lay in it for us and for our future? And for the future in general? The group turned to the logic, the eternal principles, the pure essences, as they were called by Hegel, the group's philosophic authority. St. Louis was at the center of America, the gateway to the West, the citadel of French conservatism and a beacon for German idealism. It was a West, South, and East city, as some people still even term that today.